This book is kind of like an interesting contradiction. Hi, I'm Carla with Race Walk. Thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to be talking about The Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton. But before we get started, a little bit about this channel. Here we share good thoughts about good words, and on Fridays I host a live Bible study on Instagram at Race Walk, and then I publish 2 videos a week. I publish a Bible study, and I also publish a video about books. So if you are interested in either of those things, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications so you can get updates about new videos. So anyway, just a little bit of a backstory about why I picked up this book to begin with. I knew Michael Crichton's name. I don't know that I ever actually read anything by him. So earlier in the year, I was looking at different science fiction books, and I was trying to decide what I wanted to write because we had our science fiction edition of Unexpected Journal coming out, and I really, really wasn't sure what I was going to write about. And so I was reading different books, like I read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and I was looking at different things, and I actually went to a conference, and they had a lot of science fiction books there, and one of them was this one, Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton. Now, this was back in February. I think that the discussion about the virus had started, but it really wasn't kind of on our radar in the U.S. so much. So anyway, a little bit of an overview about this, because I'm not really going to talk about this story so much as just kind of my thoughts about kind of the impact of it. So in this book, there's a probe or shuttle or something that crashes. When people go and take a piece from this crash, there's this just catastrophic outbreak in this small town, and most of the people die. Some of the people go crazy, but there's 2 people that aren't affected by this. One is an old man, and the other one is a baby. So they send in this team of experts to try to find a cure for the virus and figure out what happened. And the whole story is kind of this continuation of this, and that's what's called the Andromeda Strain. What he talks about in this, as far as like alien viruses, you're not talking about viruses from actual aliens. What he's presenting it as is that like a virus that came from Earth that has gone into space, that's changed in some way from that exposure in space, and then comes back, and it's something that humans can't handle. So that's what it is. It was really interesting reading this right before, all this hit. I'm going to give a little bit of a background of Michael Crichton. So there's some context to kind of what my beef is. I mean, the story is good. I mean, you can see how it made a good movie. Like, it's an engaging story. You want to know what happens in the end. And there are some actually good quotes. This is a good quote, I think. A crisis is made by men who enter into the crisis with their own prejudices, propensities, and predispositions. A crisis is the sum of intuition and blind spots, and a blend of facts noted and facts ignored. Yet the underlying uniqueness of each crisis is a disturbing sameness. A characteristic of all crises is their predictability in retrospect. They seem to have a certain inevitability. They seem predestined. This is not true of all crises, but it is true of sufficiently many to make many of the most hardened historians cynic and misanthropic. I think that we see that today. I mean, like what we're in, like right now as I'm recording this in Houston, it was projected weeks ago, and people ignored it because they didn't want to acknowledge it. So anyway, but as far as the book itself, it's as I was reading, it was a good story. I wanted to know the end of it. It's not really my type of book so much, and I was reading an essay in Of Other Worlds by C.S. Lewis on science fiction. And he divides science fiction into certain types, and this is what I think he would call an engineer stories. And it's a third subspecies where the interest is, in a sense, scientific but speculative. When we learn from the sciences the probable nature of places or conditions which no human being has experienced, there is in normal men an impulse to attempt to imagine them. Is any man such a dull clod that he can look at the moon through a good telescope without asking himself what it would be like to walk among those mountains under that black crowded sky? The scientists themselves, the moment they go beyond purely mathematical statements, can hardly avoid describing the facts in terms of their probable effects on the senses of the human observer. Okay, so I think that's what this is. This is more what C.S. Lewis would classify as an engineer story. And you kind of, it's helpful to know the background of Michael Crichton as you read this. So He was actually trained as a medical doctor. He graduated from Harvard Medical School, and he died in 2008 at age 66. He also wrote and directed Westworld in 1973, Coma 1978, The Great Train Robbery 1979, Looker 1981, Runaway 1984. And he published his first short story as an article in the New York Times when he was 14. He had his undergraduate degree in biological anthropology, and his first pen name was John Lang. And so he was writing as he was going through school. The Andromeda Strain was actually his first novel published under his own name as Michael Crichton. And this book was inspired by the Ipcress file by Len Dayton. This book was adapted into a movie in 1971. I think I might have watched that. I don't know. I'm not sure. So he got his medical degree in 1969, and he had a fellowship at the Salk Institute for Biology from 1969 to 1970. He was writing all of this time, but he never got his license to practice. When he published this kind of launched his career as a full-time author. He was also, this is interesting, he was a creator of ER. He experimented with psychic phenomena, so he has a lot of background in the medical field, and you see that in the book. Now I'm going to go to kind of the story itself is one thing. One of the things that looking back on this, especially like in the situation that we're in right now, I almost kind of feel like the way he presents the book, because this is the thing, he has things in here that look like they're official, like maybe you look at this and like, is this real or is it made up? And so he'll have memos like they were obtained through a Freedom of Information Act, and he'll have transcripts in here, and they have chemical charts, and then in the back there's like this whole section of what is like footnotes, like references, like all of this. So it looks like when you look at this, you're thinking, is this an actual thing? Because sometimes in fiction, it's actually inspired by or includes elements of truth, right? All of this is fake. All of this is fake. These are just made up. And I almost kind of think like this is sort of kind of a precursor, and part of the reason, like books like this are part of the reason that we seem to have this inability in huge parts of the population of distinguishing actual truth from a lie, in fact, from fiction. And it's the same thing as with the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. He said, oh, this is fiction, but then he'll say in it that this is true. And he'll make statements about like the Council of Nicaea, which are completely false. I mean, it's not even true. And like still to this day, people still believe that that's actually true. It's not. So I kind of feel like, I mean, it's interesting the way he did it, but there's really, I don't know. I really kind of feel like this is part of the problem, honestly, that there's not any sort of, because it's really presented as truth and it's not. It's really interesting as far as what we're in right now, and trying to find a vaccine for it, because that's what they were doing. And one of the articles that I read about this is that it was describing this as that they're set in the plausible presence. It's presenting it as apparent truth, but really it's a false reality. This book is kind of like an interesting contradiction. So on one hand, I think that it erodes people's ability to really distinguish fact from fiction. But on the other hand, I do think that it helps imagine what could happen, what is possible. I was reading, like when this was all breaking a couple months ago, I was reading a couple of articles that was talking about, this pandemic is a failure of imagination. It's not just policy failures that got us to this point. It's an inability to conceive of planetary threats. Another one, Mark Thiessen in the Washington Post wrote, we were caught unprepared by a pandemic 9/11. The failures began long before. 9/11, Pearl Harbor, the failure to anticipate 9/11 was like Pearl Harbor, a failure of imagination. So I think this helps develop imagination, what could happen, but along with imagination, we also need to be able to evaluate reality and what is actually true. And I don't think this necessarily helps. If you've read this, what are your thoughts? I mean, what was the stand out to you? I mean, did you, like looking back on this book and like what we're going through now, did you kind of go, holy crap? Because I kind of did. I was like, oh my goodness. This is also kind of interesting. This is the 50th anniversary of when this was published, when the coronavirus was discovered. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me know what your thoughts are on this. Do you think that books like this help? Do you think they hurt? Do you think they should like not pretend to be like actual truth? I don't know. So thanks for joining me. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you next time.